All right, I'm going to start out. And you might have heard that this is basically a synthesis of a 300-page thesis that I wrote for Brown University, undergraduate thesis. And I spent a lot of time in the South Kingstown Town Hall. But as Voltaire said, I didn't have enough time to make it shorter. So. But this is the condensed version, but hang in there. All right, in the 18th century, rural New England, including most of Rhode Island, was dominated by villages, small farms, and that produced little surplus. But in southern Rhode Island, where we are now, South County, a group of ambitious stock and dairy farmers attempted to create a landed manorial gentry. The so-called Narragansett planters succeeded to a significant extent, developing a plantation-based economy. They sold their farm products to nearby Newport merchants, who shipped most of the products to British colonies in the Caribbean. Wealth derived from commercial farming enabled the planters to attain a high standard of living, and their highest aspiration, which was to imitate the English country elite, enjoy their social prominence and political influence. But the biggest difference between the English gentry and the Narragansett planters was that the Narragansett planters relied on enslaved labor. South Kingstown, which then included the town of Narragansett, was the heart of the Narragansett country. Its planters were wealthier, more socially prominent, more politically important than their counterparts in the other three Narragansett towns, which are North Kingstown, Charlestown, and Exeter. Here's a map, and you can see Kings County is basically what South County is today, and South Kingstown, you can see, formed in 1723. This time of South Kingstown, roughly from the years 1700 to 1774, was likely the most unique in South Kingstown's history. It was the most different from the rest of New England, this period I'm talking about, and very unique. All right, I'm not going to start at the beginning of how it started. I'm going to start with the South Kingstown planters at their peak from 1730 to 1774. After that, I'll explain why it happened, and then I will explain why the society disappeared by the end of the American Revolution. First, let's nail down some names and dates. The town of Kingstown was established in 1674, and it consisted of the towns of South Kingstown, which then included Narragansett, and North Kingstown, which then included Exeter. North Kingstown and Exeter separated in 1723, and by 1730, South Kingstown included unusually large stock holdings and land holdings. The wealthiest planters owned thousands of acres, which was exceptional by New England standards. Many New England farms might have been 50 acres or so. Thomas Hazard by 1738 and William Robinson by 1751 each had purchased about 3,600 acres of land. William Gardner willed 1,620 acres in 1732, and James Perry 1,440 acres in 1766. Planters' land holdings usually consisted of several farms, so you might have one that's 500 acres, 400 acres, 300 acres. Consider 52 farms ranging from 30 to 800 acres advertised for sale or lease from 1760 to 1766 in the Newport Mercury and the Providence Gazette. Of the 12 farms that exceeded 250 acres, 7 were located in South Kingstown. The remaining 5 were in one town each. So here's a classic view of a South Kingstown plantation. This is the Henry Marchand farm. It's over on Route 2, near where the Great Swamp site is. And you can see it's intended to look like an English manor. And Ed and Carolyn Cross might be here. They allowed me to tour the place, so it's still in similar condition. The house looks like a lot like it is now. These farms were not only large by New England standards, they were productive. Probate records indicate that the number of livestock owned by South Kingstown planters far exceeded those of Rhode Island farmers outside the Narragansett country. The 11 wealthiest planters who died between 1730 and 1760 left the states averaging 400 sheep, 100 cattle, and 20 horses. That's a lot in those days. And, if you were a farmer up in the north of Rhode Island, you might be lucky to have 3 cows and 15 sheep and a horse. Individual planters exceeded these averages. For example, Jonathan Hazard in 1746 owned 676 sheep. William Robinson, 1751, owned 162 cattle. And Jeffrey Hazard, 1759, held 44 horses. The other fairly wealthy farming area was in Portsmouth, Middletown, and Jamestown, and they held less than half of those amounts. Actually, less than a third. Cheese was probably the premier important product, and South Kingstown was probably the premier cheese-producing town in all of New England. Its Rhode Island cheese and other stock and dairy products were widely traded. An English observer describing Rhode Island's grazing economy in the 1750s wrote, "Their most considerable farms are in the Narragansett country. Their highest dairy of one farm ordinarily milks about 110 cows, makes about 13,000 pounds of cheese besides butter, and sells off considerable in calves and fatted bullocks." Another English traveler who came to our area in 1744, it was named Dr. Alexander Hamilton. He met on the road John Potter of South Kingstown, quote, "a man of considerable fortune here." He spoke of Potter's farm. "He has a large house close upon the road and is the possessor of a very large farm where he milks daily 104 cows and has besides a vast stock of other cattle." John Potter lived in Matunic. Narragansett Pacers. South Kingstown was also probably New England's most important horse raising town. Its farmers raised both carting and riding horses for planters in the Caribbean and in the American South. The small, hardy Narragansett Pacers were a favorite breed throughout the British colonies in North America and in the Caribbean, and were admired for their speed and comfort. George Washington was said to have one. They paced, meaning both legs on one side moving at the same time. I just learned that recently. As James Fenimore Cooper wrote in his classic The Last of the Mohicans, these horses were sure of foot and glided over pots, roots, and holes. Now, South Kingstown planters were able to benefit from the close proximity of Newport merchants across Narragansett Bay. And I went through some surviving ledgers of Newport merchants, and they show South Kingstown planters sending great quantities of cheese, beef, hay, and livestock on the hoof to the merchants. And these merchants would then ship the goods to the British Caribbean islands and to the American South. In return, the planters received important luxuries from Europe, such as linen, silks, and chocolates, mirrors, and Madeira wine, in addition to necessities such as building materials and kitchen utensils. Here's a great portrait or painting. It's actually in the St. Louis Museum. It's called Merchants Carousing in Suriname. A lot of these are Rhode Island merchants, supposedly 4 future governors of Rhode Island. So you can tell this guy's having his unfortunate thing being put in his pocket, and this one's pouring it down his neck, and he's having some trouble over here. That may be Jeffrey Malbone. You see an enslaved person here, there's a server, one over here. This shows that, just showing this because South Kingstown was part of this new Atlantic world. They're trading products to Newport shipping them to the Caribbean and the American South. So they're really tied in. The most distinctive and upsetting feature of South Kingstown planter society was its reliance on enslaved labor. In rural New England, the vast majority of farmers maintained relatively small farms and livestock herds. So they typically produced a small surplus. They had no need for enslaved people. The South Kingstown planters, however, sought a large, cheap labor force to tend to their great herds and to cultivate their large dairy and stock farms. Not surprisingly, South Kingstown became the most important slaveholding town in all of rural New England. While blacks numbered no more than 2 or 3% of the total population in 18th century New England, and in rural areas actually much less than that. In South Kingstown, between 1730 and 1774, they constituted remarkably 16 to 25% of the town's population. In the 1770s, for example, Concord, Massachusetts had only a handful of enslaved people in the village. By contrast, the enslaved population rose from 85 in Kingstown in 1708 to 498 in South Kingstown alone by 1730. Now here's I don't know how many of you have seen this mural, saw this mural in Wakefield Post Office. So, wow, look at that, that's tremendous. So this was a great mural that by Ernest Hamlin Baker called The Economic Activities of the Narragansett Planters. It opened up in 1939 and was for decades in the Wakefield Post Office. Now it's being shown by the South County History Center in Kingston. And you know, it shows the activities of the Narragansett Planters, so it's a very valuable. You can see cheese right here, cattle, horses, sheep. So it's great to have this interpretation. I have a few problems with it, and that is the enslaved men don't have any shirts on. I mean, in actual life, they would have had shirts just like everyone else, other farmers. Also, it doesn't show women. Women were, of course, important parts, and enslaved women, I understand, helped to milk the dairy cows. Now, though they probably underestimate the actual numbers, probate and census records indicate that the average number of enslaved people working for South Kingstown planters averaged about from 5 to 20. And when he died in 1751, William Robinson, who lived on Silver Lake, he was the third wealthiest South Kingstown resident in 1744, left 19 enslaved people. That's the highest number in the South Kingstown probate records. In 1840, Elisha R. Potter Jr. of Kingston, a respected historian who undoubtedly conversed with relatives of the planters, reported to the General Assembly that Narragansett planters on average held from 5 to 40 enslaved people each. This is an advertisement for an enslaved boy by Hezekiah Babcock of South Kingston. So if you now, the vast majority of these enslaved people were black people. Planters were able to purchase African captives from Newport and Boston slave traders. Most of them were probably purchased by 1730, and after that, the population increased naturally, by natural birth. There's another close-up. South Kingstown planters typically supplemented their slave labor force with Native American servants. Most of them would have been from the Narragansett tribe. Under Rhode Island law, they were not permitted to be enslaved. However, as some recent history books have shown, occasionally some New England Indians were essentially enslaved, mostly because of the debts that they owed. This occurred mostly in the late 1600s and early 1700s. You don't see it around the time of the American Revolution. Other Indians were indentured servants for a term of years or were hired to fill temporary work needs. While most planters used only a few Indians, an exception was the town's wealthiest man in 1774, Silas Niles, who according to that year's census used in his workforce 10 Indians in addition to 6 black enslaved people. In his 1760 will, James Condon bequeathed 6 Spanish Indians. These were likely Indians who had been captured in Spanish-controlled islands in the Caribbean, and then they were sold to New England. And unfortunately, a lot of Narragansetts after King Philip's War were not enslaved in Rhode Island, but they were sold to the Caribbean. Commercial stock and dairy farming was so profitable that some sons of planters moved to Newport to become successful merchants, such as Thomas and George Hazard, Thomas Robinson, and Christopher Champlin. In turn, Newporters such as Henry Marchand, we saw his farm, and John Dockeray, you know Dockeray Street, purchased plantations in South Kingstown. So here's a farm that George Hazard at Mumford's Island. All right, anyway, it's an advertisement for a farm that a Newport merchant has that he owns in South Kingston. The elevated level of commercial activity enabled South Kingstown to support an unusually large planter class. Tax records indicate that the highest tenth of South Kingstown taxpayers between 1730 and 1760 owned from 45% to 50% of the town's wealth. And that was comparable only to towns like Boston and Newport. The highest tenth of taxpayers in rural Massachusetts and Connecticut during this period were less than half of that. The family was also important. So we have the Hazards, Robinsons, Gardners, Potters, Niles, Watsons, Browns, Perrys, and Babcocks are frequently found in the highest tenth of taxpayers. Now, wealth and family did not characterize the planter class alone. South Kingstown elites consciously tried to imitate the English country gentry in their religious, political, and social lives. Rich planters sought to affiliate themselves with churches of the elite class. Rural Rhode Island was dominated by Quakers and Baptists for the most part. But the austere and democratic nature of those religions didn't attract the upwardly mobile planters. So they got interested in the Anglican church and the congregational churches, previously confined to Newport's merchant elite. And they made impressive gains in the Narragansett country. There was an Anglican meeting house built in South Kingstown near Tower Hill in 1707. And its attendance really swelled after Reverend James McSparran from Northern Ireland assumed leadership of the parish. Wealth also brought political leadership. Other than Newport and Providence, South Kingstown was the most important town in the colony. The physical environment created by the planters testifies to their wealth and aspirations. Unlike the archetypal rural New England community, villages were unimportant to Narragansett planters. And the only villages back then were Tower Hill and Little Rest, which is now Kingston. And they only were created because they were the town seats where you had the courthouse and jail. Churches and graveyards were spread throughout the countryside. You could see the graveyards today. The houses of the planters reveal a high level of cultural standards for rural Rhode Island. We have here the Roland Robinson House, originally built in 1710 and expanded in 1759. And actually, it was supposedly much bigger than this on the right side. There was another extension. This is in Saunderstown near South Ferry. And as you can see, a beautiful house. This is more distant views. You can see the stone walls. That's the Roland Robinson house on the left, and the Casey farm, which is actually in North Kingstown, still brings an aura of the South Kingstown planters as well. This is the John Dockery house on Dockery Street, so that's in between Main Street and Route 1, the old post road, up on the hill on the right, just past South Road. He was a merchant who came over here and bought a farm. On the left is William Robinson House. He was one of the wealthiest of the planters, and his house was on Silver Lake in Wakefield. And on the right is a beautiful interior cupboard called in the house of Thomas Mumford. It's now held by the South Kingston History Center. Now, pictures show that John Potter's great house, built near Matunic in 1742, was decorated with elegant wood paneling. Potter and other planters adopted the English custom of, naming their houses with highfalutin names. Matthew Robinson called his house Hopewell, which he described as built in 1750, quote, after the style of the English lodge. Now, the decorative and fine arts left by South Kingstown planters are also impressive. In the third quarter of the 18th century, South Kingstown supported 4 silversmiths. That was unheard of anywhere in New England in colonial times. And most port towns didn't have 4. One of them was Samuel Casey. He was among the finest silversmiths in all the colonies. Boston, he lived in Kingston, Little Rest. And the Boston Fine Arts Museum advisor said that he was the only one better in New England was Paul Revere. Samuel Casey's works today can be seen in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, and the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. So, here's some lovely pieces, as you can see. Here's a great teapot, very elegant. Now, Anglican planters also had their portraits painted by famous artists of the day. John Simbert painted Reverend James McSparran and his wife Hannah Gardner of Boston Neck. So this was painted in 1729 and it's held by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. You can see a nice green silk dress. Surviving murals from the John Potter and Roland Robinson houses, though not painted by expert artists, are revealing. The Potter mural, this is now hanging in the Newport Historical Society, shows John Potter's family. He's enjoying tea on dishes of valuable porcelain and silver. Potter was a member of the Congregational Church. He wears a red coat with a ruffled red shirt containing gold buttons. 3 ladies are adorned in colorful dresses. The presence of an enslaved boy is intended to add to the atmosphere of wealth and status. I think also adds a touch of intimacy too. The mural in the Robinson house shows the planter on horseback sacking a deer, a favorite sport of the English aristocracy at the time. However, the wealth and status of the South Kingstown planters should not be exaggerated. They were definitely well off by New England rural standards, but they were not nearly as wealthy as the planters in Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina. They produced tobacco, rice, and indigo, which were far more valuable than the livestock and foodstuffs that the planters created. As an example, as I mentioned, that South Kingston planters on the average had a workforce of about 5 to 20 enslaved people. By contrast, planters on their plantations in the South, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, commonly had workforces ranging from 100 to 300 enslaved people. Now, although South Kingstown society was somewhat refined, really the most sophisticated in the area were the Newport merchants and other elites in Newport. The scramble for wealth at times could be unappealing. John Potter, right here, was previously mentioned as a wealthy planter at his great house in Matunic. He was convicted of participating in a counterfeiting money ring. And he only was able to get his ears not cropped by paying 10,000 pounds. Samuel Casey, the silversmith, he had his house in Little Rest in Kingston burned down in 1764, and he turned to counterfeiting. He was caught. And the jury didn't want to sentence him to death, but he didn't want to convict him, but those days, I guess the judge made him do it, and they convicted him, and the judge sentenced him to death. That was a serious crime in those days. But the villagers one day surrounded the jail in Kingston and freed him, and he was never heard from again. That's going to be a future Small State Big History article, so you guys want to read that. The presence of black slaves and Indian servants led to the creation of a very strict social order, largely based on race. White planters stood at the top of the social regime and enjoyed most of the freedom. Enslaved people, of course, enjoyed the least freedom. Not only were they not paid for their work, their liberty was greatly circumscribed in an attempt to reduce the risk of slave rebellion. South Kingstown supplemented Rhode Island slave code, already the harshest in New England, with even harsher restrictions, restricting black people. As in other slave societies, terror was used to enforce the laws. Reverend McSparran kept a diary, and he writes of beating an enslaved man, one of his men, for breaking Rhode Island's curfew law for non-whites. He also beat an enslaved woman for violating a local law by receiving a gift from an enslaved male suitor without permission. I do have to add that the woman ran away to a neighbor who was one of the gardeners, the planters, and they came over and informed McSparran, we don't like to treat enslaved people like that, but it did happen. Members of the Narragansett tribe often lived in their own households. In the 1774 census, for example, 99 of the town's 220 Indians lived in their own households. But some were so destitute in making that conversion to the capitalist system that they hired themselves out as indentured servants and lived with white families. Poor landless whites enjoyed some freedom, though their opportunities were limited because of the influx of cheap labor from black and Indian labor. These whites sometimes depended on planters for seasonal work, but that was just seasonal work. Only whites who owned a certain amount of land had the right to vote. This social system based on slavery made South Kingstown resemble the colonial South more than the English countryside. Planters in Rhode Island and southern colonies were similar in kind. They both resided on isolated estates, engaged in commercial farming, depended heavily on enslaved labor, and dominated their communities socially and politically. All right, now what led to the demise of the South Kingstown planters? The rise. This takes us back to the 17th and early 18th centuries. There were a variety of factors that converged to make the South Kingstown planters pretty dominant by 1730. In short, the rising demand from Newport merchants for livestock and produce to trade to the Caribbean markets attracted ambitious stock and dairy farmers to the Narragansett countries. There was also a jurisdictional dispute between Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, but Rhode Islanders were from Aquidneck Island were more aggressive in ignoring that. It kept the land prices low, but they went ahead anyway. Now, Newport merchants in the 17th century discovered eager markets in the Caribbean and southern colonies for livestock and provisions. In the British Caribbean, sugar was the key. As an export crop, it was way more valuable than even tobacco and rice and indigo. Sugar planters in Jamaica, Barbados, and other British colonies made vast fortunes. And the raising of sugar was so profitable that they didn't bother to set aside land to raise their own food. So they relied on places like South Kingstown to bring the food to them. Most of the population in the British colonies were enslaved. They worked in very brutal conditions in sugar plantations. I talk about some of this in my Dark Voyage book. Now, New England merchants thus had a ready market for surplus farm products, and Newport merchants in particular needed a hinterland to provide these farm products. So ambitious farmers in Aquidneck Island saw potential across the bay in the Narragansett country. Land in southern Rhode Island was well suited for developing a commercial farm economy based on grazing. We know we have fertile soil, high quality grass, open pastures, made an ideal area for raising livestock. Southern Rhode Island also benefits from warm weather and shorter winters, unlike the rocky and less fertile coastlands of northern Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Connecticut. Much better here. Now, there's also the Puritan hierarchy, the Puritans of the 1600s in Massachusetts. They really inhibited the development of big farms. They wanted to develop small villages. They wanted to have a central green and keep everyone close by so they could keep an eye on them. And they really limited allotting land. This was in Connecticut and Massachusetts, not Rhode Island. And they also gave more land to wealthier people from England and less land to common laborers, for instance. One area in Rhode Island that has a common is Little Compton. It's got nice houses around it, and it's got the grave start next to the Continental Congregational Church. But it was actually formed in Massachusetts and was transferred to Rhode Island in 1747. Initially, the original four towns of Rhode Island, Providence, Portsmouth, Newport, and Warwick, followed this compact village plan. Providence, led by Roger Williams, actually allotted lands equally, which was pretty impressive. Here's a kind of an idealized view of Roger Williams and landing in Providence. And here are the land allotments that you can see. And here's the spring up here. And there's Roger Williams, so he's actually closest to the spring. So some people are more equal than others, I guess. Portsmouth and Newport, on the other hand, divided townsmen according to their social status. So if you're higher social status, you got more land. That didn't make a lot of people happy. So they went looking around for more land. In 1657 and 1658, speculators from Portsmouth bought from some Narragansett Indians a 12-mile square tract in the heart of the Narragansett country. This was the land called the Pettaquamscot Purchase. It was eventually became Kingstown. and included most of Kingstown, included most of what is now South Kingstown and Narragansett. The purchasers assigned thousands of acres to each member and offered the remainder for sale. Of course, the price paid to the Narragansetts was piddling, amounting to theft. The Narragansett who participated in the sale undoubtedly did not understand the impact of the sale. Yeah, that's the Petaquamscut purchase, dividing the lands. Now, widespread settlement, and the prior picture is Ninigret, the second from the Antic tribe related to the Narragansett. So it's a great portrait that's held by the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. Now, the widespread settlement of Kingstown was inhibited by these competing land claims. The so-called Atherton Syndicate, made up of influential Massachusetts speculators, used fraudulent means in 1659 and 1660 to obtain from the Narragansetts land that overlapped the Petaquamscut purchase. Huge amount of land. And the speculators gimmed up a fine of 595 feet of wampum imposed on the Narragansetts. And when it was not paid, they, in quote, foreclosed on the mortgage and took the land. Obviously, fraud. A struggle over the two competing claims among the white claimants immediately ensued. The Atherton Syndicate turned to Connecticut and then to validate their claim. So Connecticut said, hey, we own the Narragansett country, all of South County. And Rhode Islanders said, no, it's part of Rhode Island. So throughout the remainder of the 17th century and into the 18th century, there was this dispute in southern Rhode Island. Who owned it, Connecticut or Rhode Island? And Massachusetts got involved a bit too. Both sides sent envoys to London to plead their cause. Here's a map by that Mark Gardner provided for me. You can see the Petaquamscut purchase here. This is the Atherton purchase. Obviously, at this point it's Indian land, but these whites are being very aggressive. This fight between Rhode Island and Connecticut accounts for the names of Kingstown, South Kingstown, and North Kingstown. Rhode Islanders wanted the sympathy of the British king, so they named everything with a king in it. What was the name of the county? Kings County. Kings Province first, and then Kings County. But Rhode Islanders were clever. They didn't name a particular king, because they knew that the king might get deposed, they might have a new king. Now, the presence of the powerful Narragansett tribe at first discouraged settlement. That threat ended in December 1675 and in 1676, when the power of the Narragansetts was virtually wiped out in King Philip's War. Before the climactic massacre in the Great Swamp in South Kingstown by Massachusetts and Connecticut soldiers, not Rhode Islanders, the Narragansetts drove the settlers, including Rhode Islanders, from the Narragansett country back to Aquidneck Island and destroyed their farms. And some farmers, white farmers, said they rendered the town a desolate wilderness again, replenished with howling wolves and other wild creatures. Only when the war ended did settlers return to their farms. So you had this situation, you had Connecticut and Rhode Island fighting over jurisdiction. It kept land prices really low. That meant that some farmers who borrowed money or were able to get funds could buy a lot of land. And ultimately, Rhode Island won because more of them were willing to move here. If you're from Connecticut, Massachusetts, oh, you don't want to wind up in Rhode Island. They're heretics. They don't believe in the Congregational Church as being the established church. So the free market economy in Rhode Island and its lack of a dominant established religion worked in the colony's favor. The few settlers who did venture into the anarchy of 17th century Kingstown were able to acquire large tracts of cheap land. So a Portsmouth farmer in 1670 could sell his farm worth about 150 shillings per acre and use that money to buy hundreds of acres in Kingstown for 2 shillings an acre. And Robert Hazard probably did exactly that when he bought 500 acres near what is now Kingston Village in 1671 for 28 pounds. He was a surveyor, so you did what you could to earn money. Others were tenant farmers. Some were married into Pettaquamscut purchasers' families and inherited land. And then these early settlers would sell their thousands of acres and raise money, and then they would purchase livestock. And by 1678, there were only 142 families moving to Kingstown. But when it became apparent by 1700 that Rhode Island was going to win this jurisdictional dispute, then land prices started to increase. By 1708, Kingstown's population had increased dramatically to 1,200, making it the third most populous town in Rhode Island, behind only Newport and Providence. In 1723, Kingstown was separated into South Kingstown and North Kingstown. And by 1730, South Kingstown had 1,523 inhabitants, while 2,105 resided in North Kingstown. And population pressures increased demand for more land, and that meant rising land prices. Thomas Hazard, for example, in 1698 purchased 900 acres for 700 pounds, but in 1710, just 12 years later, it cost him 500 pounds to purchase just 300 acres. Now, enterprising, as I said, enterprising landholders used this money to buy livestock and enslave people. Roland Robinson's investments followed this pattern. In 1709, he bought 3,000 acres of vacant lands in Charlestown. Used to be owned by the Narragansetts, but it was acquired by the state, and they wanted the colony, and they wanted that land sold. And Robinson sold a lot of that land, and then he reinvested. By the time of his death in 1716, he sold 2,700 acres of these vacant lands in Charlestown. He was perhaps Kingstown's greatest stockholder, owning at his death 666 sheep, 175 cattle, and 55 horses. And he willed his son, William, 9 black enslaved people and 680 acres of land. So you can see here 9 Negroes right here. And, you know, the same, it's valued the same as the sheep and lambs and oxen. So the capital gained from land speculation and surplus stock and dairy farming enabled ambitious farmers to accumulate enough land to begin family dynasties. And then they passed on their new wealth and social position to their sons. Commercial farming had enabled about a dozen families to establish a planter class whose position would remain firm up to the American Revolution. But within 2 generations, it was all gone. What happened? By 1775, South Kingstown planters had serious demographic problems, increasing population, rising land prices, over-exportation of their horses, the movements to free enslaved people in the American Revolutionary War speeded up the planters' downfall. At the end of the Revolutionary War, South Kingstown was really like the rest of New England. Starts with increasing population. The population was 965 in 1730, 1,405 in 1748, and 2,185 in 1774. The problem is, in a pre-industrial agricultural society, you need about 250 acres to 1,000 acres to be a planter. The problem was that family lands were being divided among young men. You know, some in England, they might use primogeniture, where they would give most of the estate to the eldest son. But Americans didn't like that. They were more democratic. We want to treat all of our children equally. So they would divide the farms among the children. William Robinson in 1751 left a will dividing 1,385 acres between 9 sons and grandsons. The eldest son, Roland, received most of the land, the homestead farm. We saw that photograph. But that amounted to only 300 acres. And this was experienced by all the families, the Hazards, Gardners, and other planter families. So the division of family estates meant smaller stock holdings and a reduction in agricultural surplus. I mentioned the 11 wealthiest farmers in probate records held 400 sheep, 100 cattle, and 20 horses between 1730 and 1760. These average holdings fell to less than half of that between 1762 and 1774. Slavery was also less important. Fewer laborers were needed if your farm was smaller. 4 inventories between 1743 and 1752 listing the highest number of holdings of enslaved people averaged 13, By 1771, that figure declined to 6. One reason was the South Kingstown Quakers, led by Thomas Hazard, followed the example of the Friends in Philadelphia to free their enslaved people. In 1771, the South Kingstown Quakers threatened to expel members who kept enslaved people. In June 1773, South Kingstown Quakers, appointed to, quote, visit slave keepers, proudly reported that, quote, they don't find there is any held by slaves as by friends. So that's pretty impressive. I actually told my thesis advisor that at Brown University. He didn't believe me, but because some of these people were wealthy and they gave up their enslaved people. Some of them got tossed out of the Quaker religion because they didn't. South Kingstown planters were also guilty of over-exporting their best breeding horses, the Narragansett Pacers. Wealthy West Indian Caribbean planters sent agents up to Newport to buy all the best breeds in Narragansett County. Economic disaster struck in 1775. Planters in the British Caribbean had borrowed so much money, suddenly the debt burst. And there was a recession that occurred in the carrying trade. That carrying trade, delivering food and livestock to the Caribbean. The Revolutionary War hastened the downfall of both Newport commerce and South Kingstown planters. While the war's effects on Newport are well known, its influence on the Narragansett economy is not. Now, because America was trying to gain independence from Britain, the British government, not surprisingly, cut off trade with the British Caribbean islands. So that was their best market right there, lost. British troops stationed in Newport raided South Kingstown on several occasions. In 1777 and 1779, they seized sheep, cattle, cheese, and white and black laborers. Some planters were Tories, and they eventually left, went to England or Canada, and they had their farms confiscated. Services were suspended during the war at the Anglican Church since the Reverend Samuel Fairweather insisted on continuing to practice the blessing of King George III. The American Revolution also led to the abolition of slavery in the state. Part of it was definitely the rhetoric of the Revolution. Also, enslaved men during the war were able to gain their freedom by enlisting in Rhode Island's famous Black Regiment. This is a drawing done by a French officer in 1782. So they could join the regiment, and as long as they signed up for the war, they were free. Others also gained their freedom by serving for white men who, during universal draft, so if you were a white farmer and you were drafted to join the army to fight the British, maybe during the Rhode Island campaign when the Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut tried to take over Newport from the British, you could get your enslaved black person to take over. They might not agree, so you'd have to say, all right, well, if you do it, I'll free you. So some of them got free that way. In 1779, the General Assembly voted to disallow selling enslaved people out of the state. This legislation was inspired by an attempt by Carter Hazard of South Kingstown to sell an enslaved woman and her 3 daughters to a slave buyer from North Carolina. In 1784, the General Assembly passed a law gradually abolishing slavery. So anyone born after that date would be free when they reached an adult age. In reality, the end of slavery occurred much quicker than that. Here's an image of Eleanor Eldridge, who was the daughter of an enslaved woman from Rhode Island. Joanne Mellish edited a book on her. Most importantly, the town bore a heavy burden in paying Rhode Island's war taxes. South Kingstown residents usually paid the 3rd highest percentage of taxes in the colony behind Newport and Providence. But the British occupied Newport from 1776 to 1779. The French occupied it for a year. Its economy was in a shambles. The American Army stayed in Providence quite a lot, and Providence's maritime economy was not doing great. So suddenly, rural South Kingstown was expected to bear the bulk of the tax burden, but it wasn't doing great either. Thus, in 1780, South Kingstown was assessed twice the tax paid by Newport residents and 1/3 more than Providence. The anger over high taxes in South County and other rural areas in the state lasted for more than a decade. It's perhaps the main reason why Rhode Island was the last of the original colonies to adopt the U.S. Constitution. The leader of the anti-Constitution movement was Jonathan Hazard of South Kingstown. By war's end, South Kingstown was no longer the gentry society of isolated estates and large farms. It was more like other New England towns, filled with small farms, creating small surpluses. Compact villages like Wakefield, Saunderstown, and Perryville arose. Townspeople now preferred to go to churches in villages rather than spread throughout the countryside. Significantly, in 1800, the Anglican Meeting House, which had been located in between Little Rest and Tower Hill, was moved to Wickford. So I'm sure you've seen that, in 1800. By the early 19th century, the transformation of South Kingstown was so complete that a grandson of one prominent planter noted, "Few persons are now aware of the change that has taken place in society here within the last 50 or 60 years." So I return to the mural that's at the South Kingstown History Center, and maybe you can appreciate it a little bit more after my talk. Thank you.